Good afternoon. Welcome to the Atlantic Council for this month's Cyber Risk Wednesday. I'd like to point out that this time we actually did it on a Wednesday. I think the last few have been on a Thursday. So we play that fast and loose. My name is Joshua Corman. I'm the director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative, joined recently. I'm also one of the founders of IamTheCavalry.org, which has been a grassroots volunteer organization focused on cyber safety in the Internet of Things, and we hope to merge the great work the Cyber Statecraft Initiative has done with this growing concern where it's beyond privacy, but it's where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood in cars, medical devices, and the Internet of Things, very apropos for today's topic of what is the government's role in the Internet of Things. This afternoon will be a moderated panel discussion on the government's role in securing the Internet of Things, safety, privacy, and otherwise, other security concerns. And what we really like to figure out is, for something as emergent as this new wave of technology, where should the government lead, follow, and stay out of the way? And we'll have a diversity of opinions on that topic, I'm sure, including we want to elicit some from the audience. Today's event is part of the Atlantic Council's monthly Cyber Risk Wednesday event series. The series is designed to bring together relevant experts from government, industry, and other stakeholders to examine topics to the core of our mission. With this afternoon, we want to discuss a topic that is an incredibly distinguished group of experts, which we'll introduce shortly, is identify some of the nuances and challenges of the various types of the Internet of Things. First up, we're going to have some opening remarks from Angela Simpson. She will provide opening remarks for the panel discussion. She's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Department of Commerce's NTIA, or National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and she has served as the Director of Federal Regulatory at Covad Communications, practiced communications law at Squire, Sanders, and Dempsey, LLP, and was an Assistant Director at the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions Trade Association. We will introduce the panelists after, but please join me in welcoming Angela to the stage. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the Atlantic Council, first and foremost, for inviting me and convening this panel today to talk about this important and exciting topic. I personally am very excited to hopefully get a sneak peek today at the kinds of things folks might be planning to file in the Department of Commerce's request for comments on Internet of Things that we'll be getting comments in next week. So to kick things off, the Internet of Things is a nebulous term, and that means many different things to many different people. It can be as simple as a smart lamp that somebody can turn off with their phone, or it could be as complex as an industrial monitoring system that can optimize production and supply chains. But the essential premise of the Internet of Things is a smarter, safer, and more connected world. Healthcare, transportation, energy, the environment, public safety, all of these industries have the potential to be transformed for the better through the deployment of connected devices. The potential scope of IoT is also clear. Estimates from Intel and the IDC predict that there will be as many as 200 billion connected devices in the world by 2020, or about 25 devices per person. And according to McKinsey analysis, the Internet of Things could have an economic impact of $11 trillion a year by 2025. These numbers speak to the promise of IoT, but we also recognize that the opportunities do not come without potential challenges. Properly addressing things like privacy and cybersecurity concerns will be key. Also, the cross-industry nature of the Internet of Things leaves open the threat of a patchwork regulatory regime that could dampen investment and delay progress. Today's panelists are being asked, when should government lead, follow, or get out of the way when it comes to IoT? This is a vital question, and it's also one that the Department of Commerce is eager to explore as well. In April, NTIA issued a request for comments on the potential benefits and challenges of IoT and the role that the government should play in fostering growth in this arena. We're excited to hear the perspectives from a broad group of stakeholders, including businesses, entrepreneurs, researchers, and civil society. But we're currently in listening mode, and we want to hear from the community as to the proper path forward. But why should you be talking to the Department of Commerce and NTIA on this matter? First, we have a long-standing technological and policy expertise base to draw on. The Commerce Department has been working in several areas relevant to IoT, including cybersecurity, privacy, cross-border data flows, international trade, big data, and standards policy. At NTI specifically, we're working to address the growing demand for spectrum, which is in part being fueled by the exciting advances in IoT applications. At our labs in Colorado, for example, we're testing the effects of the Internet of Things on spectrum usage and developing cutting-edge spectrum sharing technologies. We're also partnering with the Federal Communications Commission on a model city initiative, which is going to connect ambitious cities with industry, government agencies, and spectrum experts to test advanced spectrum sharing applications in a real-world environment. And we continue to embrace a bottom-up, multi-stakeholder approach to resolving technical and policy challenges related to the internet. I had the pleasure to meet Josh Corman here, although he was in another capacity at the time, at the beginning of our multi-stakeholder process that's currently exploring cybersecurity vulnerabilities in the context of how companies and security researchers work together. And I'm excited to hear his perspectives here today on the intersection of cybersecurity and the Internet of Things. Elsewhere in the Department of Commerce, NIST's Global City Teams Challenge is helping entrepreneurs develop and scale their Internet of Things and smart city applications. Also, NIST, NTIA, and the International Trade Administration, which is also a part of the Department of Commerce, have engaged in IoT issues internationally, working with standards bodies on IoT and cybersecurity, and partnering with other agencies on innovative funding mechanisms for smart cities projects. So, in a nutshell, we want to leverage the expertise of the Department of Commerce to help encourage growth, cooperation, and innovation in the IoT space for American companies. But at the same time, we also want to help mitigate privacy and security issues related to the Internet of Things. So what are we looking for in terms of input to our RFC? Here are some of our key questions that we've been asking. First, how should we think about this issue differently compared to past technological advances? When it comes to the benefits and challenges of IoT, what sets it apart? Will the policy approaches need to change? Next, how do you define the Internet of Things? I used the word nebulous earlier. So how important is it actually to settle on a specific definition or definitions, and what are the implications there? Third, how should the US government approach measurement of the IoT industry? What are the new metrics or the data collection tools that we might need in this space? And fourth, and probably most relevant to our discussion here today, what are the cybersecurity and what are the privacy concerns that are specific to the Internet of Things, and how should those be addressed? So the deadline for our comments is June 2nd, so there's a little more than a week to go and just one holiday weekend in between. But I do encourage folks to weigh in to the extent they can, and I encourage folks to look and see what ends up getting posted, because it might be of interest to you as well. In terms of next steps after next week, later this summer, the department is planning to host a workshop to continue the conversation. We're going to draft and issue an agenda-setting green paper in government terms that identifies the key takeaways from the comments that we receive and will help set a path forward. But for now, we have a smart and diverse panel that will tackle some of these issues for us, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say. So without further ado, let me thank you and turn it back over to Josh. Thanks.
All right, so we're going to invite the panelists to come up to their assigned seating, and while they do so, I'd like to encourage you to participate in the conversation. We do partner with the Christian Science Monitor, CSM Passcode. So I'd encourage you all to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ACCyber and the Twitter handle of CSM Passcode. So please join me in your assigned seats, and we will introduce you. Get little name tags. All right. All right. All right, so heading this way, I'll first introduce Aaron Alva. He's a tech policy fellow with the Federal Trade Commission, and before FTC, Aaron contributed to the University of Washington Tech Policy Lab and completed a joint JD and MS in Information Management as a National Science Foundation CyberCorp Scholarship recipient at the University of Washington. Please wave. All right. Nyla Beth Gowell is a principal at Booz Allen Hamilton after successfully standing up the IoT Crosscuts 6 workstream team, partnership, and pipeline In April 2015, she continues to manage and grow Booz Allen's IoT investment across connected architectures, product services, and activities. Thank you. Dwayne Kobayashi is the in-house intellectual property counsel for Senseware, an IoT company that generates actionable insights through the deployment of a tightly integrated sensor network platform using plug-and-play wireless connectivity. Thank you for joining us. And John Miller is Vice President of Global Cybersecurity and Privacy Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council, where he leads ITI's work on cybersecurity, privacy, surveillance, and other public policy issues. All right, so usually these things start with, let's define IoT, but I'm going to throw a few frameworks for consideration, and then we'll see how we do this. While we're defining this, and feel free to latch on to any part of this, there really isn't a single Internet of Things. We have precursors in machine-to-machine, embedded systems. For the sake of cohorts or clusters that make sense, we've noticed that there seems to be an Internet of Vehicles or something around connected vehicles, cars, shipping containers, et cetera. There seems to be a different set of issues around connected medical technology. You'll notice that in these cohorts, there's a regulator, there's a series of industry participants, there's different stakeholders, there's different timelines for bringing things to market. So we tend to see vehicles as a cluster. We tend to see medical technologies as a cluster. We tend to see the industrial internet as a completely different set, maybe industrial control systems, SCADA systems, and the like, smart cities, infrastructure. And then lastly, more consumer IoT, which is the most varied, but also has its own particular common ground. So we'll probably float amongst these because they each do have different implications. One of the things that I Am the Cavalry published to try to frame where to get started, instead of assuming that we have proven standards for this emergent topic, is we basically pointed out that you should have, if you understand that all systems fail, then we offered up that your basic capability, you must be this tall to ride the Internet of Things, involve 5 capabilities and ready postures towards failure. And in layperson speak, tell your customers how you avoid failure, tell your researchers that you will not sue them if they help you avoid failure, tell your customers how you will capture, study, and learn from failure, how you'll have a prompt and agile response to failure, and how you'll contain and isolate failure. So the terms of art we've been using is, what is your safety by design principles? And I know the FTC has comments on that. Number 2 is, do you have a published coordinated vulnerability disclosure program, which is something that US Commerce NTIA's open multi-stakeholder workshop is trying to drive voluntary adoption for coordinated vulnerability disclosure programs, encouraging high trust, high collaboration between the finders and receivers of bugs. The third one's tough. It's going to take a lot of thinking and scrutiny over the role of government, but do we have tamper-evident forensically sound evidence capture, or something like a black box, such that we can capture evidence, learn from failures to improve future design, like we do with the NTSB for airlines? Fourth one is, do you have the ability to update your products? If you think about Heartbleed, about half of the original affected systems that were vulnerable to the OpenSSL flaw were not capable of being remediated. So when the Internet of Things meets vulnerabilities that are unpatchable, you're stuck with the choice of throwing the device away or tolerating permanent exposure. And the last one is, do you separate critical systems from non-critical systems? I think it'll be commonplace that our vehicles will be compromised. The question is, will they change our radio presets, or will they disable the brakes? So within that guise of telling your customers how you avoid failure, telling researchers you'll take help avoiding failure, how we capture, study, and learn from failure, how will you have a prompt and agile response to failure, and how we contain and isolate failure. One of the things we'd like to tease out with the audience by the time we're done is, against that kind of a framework, is there a role for government? Which things will the private sector do better or sooner, and which things will they never do without help? But keep that in the back of your mind. I'd like to hear opening remarks from each of you, and we'll start with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I am the Tech Policy Fellow at the FTC, but I'll start a disclaimer saying that these views are solely mine and not necessarily those of the Commission. So please keep that in mind with my remarks. But that being said, when asked to think about the role that government has in IoT with regard to regulation, I think that the FTC approach has been something that I think could be applicable to IoT as a whole when it comes to security, privacy, onward towards safety types of regulations. And so that approach is essentially based on our over 100-year-old statute, which is to protect consumers against unfair and deceptive practices. And that is kind of borne out in what the FTC does in kind of two major buckets. One major bucket is kind of an enforcement bucket. So the FTC brings cases against companies that have failed to or have been deceptive or have shown to have unfair practices. And particularly in the security context, a lot of unfair practices revolve around unreasonable security, or excuse me, what is reasonable security versus what is not reasonable, what might be unfair. And so kind of examples in the IoT context, back in 2014, the FTC brought arguably our first IoT case against TrendNet, which was an IP-connected camera that was used by consumers to either monitor the home or in a lot of cases do baby monitoring. This kind of hits home. I have a 9-week-old at home, and so this is something that can, just from like an individual standpoint, it seems quite visceral in terms of potential harms that could come from internet connected, such as IoT devices being publicly accessible without proper authentication online for anyone to view. So that's one example from the enforcement context, and we can talk about more as we go. And another example in terms of regulatory approaches to IoT from FTC is in the context of guidance, reports, consumer education, business education, and we can also talk about more as we go, but the FTC released an IoT report back in 2015, as well as recently a Big Data Commission report, and those kind of provide informed, collected opinions from security experts, from other researchers on certain reasonable security methods that would apply to IoT specifically. And I will stop there. I think those provide a good kind of sense of the flexibleness of the FTC statute in relation to IoT and kind of the FTC's approach in this space.
Okay. And I'll be coming back to your start with security a little bit later. Nyla?
Sure. So Nyla Beth Gavel with Booz Allen, and for those of you who have heard of Booz Allen before, it's a consulting firm, more than 100 years old. And if we think about what IoT means for a lot of our clients who are both government as well as commercial enterprises, is that I'd say it means two things. It means exponential challenges and opportunities and juxtaposition of all decision making. And it's those two themes, I think, that we're really seeing that I think shape where government can be involved in driving IoT innovation frankly, for the country, but for the economy. And so exponential, lots and lots of devices. We heard Angela mention the estimates on both the number of devices to be connected and then the monetization and what that may mean. But it also means exponentially more decisions to be made in any organization. When we're thinking about enterprise IoT, the decision isn't as important as, will the coffee maker work when it's networked to my phone, as much as what risk does that bring? And all of a sudden, if I'm running a multi-billion-dollar company and everyone's putting their coffee maker in the office online, what does that do to all of my network management? So very daily decisions, when applied in an enterprise, have exponential ramifications now on organizations' ability to make decisions, to make policies, and to set their own directions. And that leads to the juxtaposition. So I think IoT offers all these opportunities and challenges in really new and unique ways. I look at it from some of the pillars of what makes IoT so special. So first, I'd say the analytics. It's the value of the data that's being transmitted by all these devices that makes organizations more effective, or the people more effective. And so there's juxtaposition there in the data. You need access to a lot more data to find that value. But with that access, you need governance. You need boundaries and rules as to who can access it, where it's coming from, authentication of the data, knowing that the data is actually what it purports to be. So there's some tug of war there. I think that's very true when you think about the standards too. Industry has been doing IoT for a long time. If you look at oil and gas, for example, they've had predictive maintenance and pipeline monitoring for a very long time. That's a highly standardized industry already. So where are there additional needs now because of the technology evolution? And where is the boundary on limiting innovation and still providing flexibility, since the pace of technological development is well going to outpace a regulatory framework. So how do we have that juxtaposition and balance again in that area? And then of course, cybersecurity. So how can, in a technological arena where I would say you need some degree of open access, where technologies need to be able to talk to each other, data needs to be easily exchanged, interoperability has to happen, backwards interfaces have to be built. How can you do that and still ensure security? And I think that's one of the biggest tug of wars in IoT, because open, agile, and secure is a very hard combination to maintain. And I think understanding the industries, as you talked about, and what their real nuances are, areas where industry already is maybe even self-regulating itself, or where it's beneficial to the manufacturers and others to be interoperable, to be open, vice where government maybe needs to drive to limit proprietary solutions or endeavors, is going to be important, again, to understand that juxtaposition. So two ways I would look at it.
You know, you're reminding me of something that typically by choice we have truncated enterprise IoT. But one of our sister organizations, BuildItSecure.ly or Build It Securely, one of them quipped, I think it was Zach Lanier said, IoT is the new BYOD. So it takes a lot of the same kind of bring your own device challenges and amplifies them.
Yeah. If I add one thing I think too there, just in that example, is you're talking about IT organizations and everybody who works,
right?
Whether it be in a mission operational capacity in government, whether it be the people who are the line workers in some type of industry, healthcare providers. So now, is it an IT department decision, or is it the organization's decision? And again, that tug of war, whole new paradigms, I think, have to emerge.
Yeah, enterprise does open up a new can of worms. Several espionage examples have happened through smart televisions or thermometers or things with microphones that could listen into sensitive conversations. All right, excellent perspective. All right, Dwayne.
Okay, so I work with SenseWare. It's a 3-year-old startup. So we are bringing a very different perspective from probably some of the other panelists here. We are taking it from a very grassroots level. I've worked in the technology industry for quite a while. I've talked to semiconductor device manufacturers, and they are laser focused on the fact that the IoT means millions and millions of chips. That is their laser focus into the near future. What we are seeing, just as a perspective, as we're bringing products and services to market, is there's a lot of education that has to happen, both with our customers, understanding the technology and the ramifications of such. I think the timing of this is fantastic. I think it is an educational exercise, and while we deal with companies and clients that are fairly sophisticated, having them understand the ramifications and the reach of technology is actually a very big challenge. This is beyond just the value proposition that we can bring in terms of the service, but in and of itself, all the concerns of cybersecurity, and the impact. Nala just made mention of the IT versus the operations department. That's a very big issue. Because somehow we have to integrate these services to an existing functionality in an organization. And a lot of times there is an interplay, and oftentimes what has to happen first and foremost is just education. Understanding how is our technology going to integrate with their existing platform, understanding the ramifications of potential data that could appear on their networks or separate from their networks. These are all issues that we're trying to help our clients grapple with. From a regulatory standpoint, I'm probably not the best to speak of the particular things I'd like to see, all to say that we work with government regulations. Some of the things we do with environmental monitoring are actually in response to government regulations for environment within commercial space. So we understand that, government regulation is just part of the equation. How we deal with the much broader issues in terms of cybersecurity, we're probably not going to be the first voice on that chair. But understanding that the pace of technology is rapid. It is going to be increasingly consuming in the commercial space as well as just the consumer space. We anticipate that. All of the industries in the semiconductor space, they are anticipating that. And of course, how that pace of technology goes hand in hand with the pace of policy, that is obviously the open question that we're going to try and at least touch on. But from our perspective, we're excited. The rate of innovation is changing rapidly. The opportunity for new services increasing at an even faster rate. We know there's a lot of niches of technology that are yet to be exploited, and we're looking to basically build a platform that can be flexibly applied across those spaces, commercial, residential, whatever opportunities arise. But in every endeavor, we understand that education and a growing with the technology has to happen. So that's kind of the perspective that we've seen so far.
Specifically to your area, before we move, I'm finding fewer people than I expected understand some of the use cases for instrumented and sensor grids in industrial environments or automobiles. Do you have a favorite concrete example of the benefit of this high instrumentation?
Sure. In general, if you think of a workplace, obviously if you look at optimization of workplace, you're dealing with lighting, you're dealing with the HVAC, you're dealing with temperature, humidity. All of these things are part and parcel of what every enterprise deals with. But one of the big issues is how do they get actionable data to actually affect change? So there are sometimes government regulations related to the air quality. So getting that data is a big part of the process, and there's a huge opportunity in terms of a value proposition of actually being able to quickly deploy sensor networks to get the data to provide actionable insight. Environmental is obviously key. In the industrial space, it is much as Nyla made reference that this is not necessarily a new endeavor. Companies, industries want to find data to help them identify maintenance opportunities. But one of the biggest challenges is how do you get that data quickly, deploy it with low cost, get that data quickly, be able to analyze it with a very scalable platform. Believe it or not, some of the organizations today still use personal monitoring and logging of data. And while that may seem somewhat backward and overly time consuming, it's just a reality of many enterprises. So providing a low-cost opportunity to get the data quickly in real time, that's always a challenge, and that's always a benefit for organizations, be it residential or commercial. That's going to exist throughout the industry. But the number of use cases, as I said, is going to expand rapidly, because every single client we've probably talked to, as soon as we provide the opportunity and understanding of what a platform can provide, the very first thing they entertain is, what other pieces of data can I get? And if I could get that piece of data, then now what could I do with it? So the emphasis and kind of the trend that we're seeing is always the desire for more data. Nobody asks for less data. Everybody wants more data. My kids tell me this all the time. I want this data and I want it now. They've grown accustomed to that. And instead of reading a newspaper and 10-hour-old events, sporting events, they just go online and they want the data now at their fingertips. Everybody wants more data. That's going to be true of any enterprise, any residential space, and that's the trend that's going to continue to accelerate.
Yeah, I think one of the ones that's, I was at a building IoT conference in Germany. It was mostly industrial. And they're so excited at the ability to do predictive maintenance to avoid much more catastrophic failures or interruptions of service. In their desire to put the instrumentation everywhere, they haven't realized that they've allowed command and control from anywhere or deception from anywhere. Yeah. So the promise and the peril is a little amplified in industrial. Yes. All right, let's move to John for the last opening remarks.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting this event, and also for everyone for coming here. First, a couple of words about ITI, who all of you may or may not be familiar with. Information Technology Industry Council, ITI. We are a technology trade association based here in Washington, D.C., but we have very much a global perspective. All of our members do business globally. Approximately a third of our members are headquartered outside of the United States, and these are, most of the companies that way back when used to be like Dwayne's company, but now are much larger companies like the Intels and Apples and Microsofts and Googles and Facebooks, and then internationally based companies like Samsung and SAP. But then also increasingly we have companies that are probably indicative of what we're talking about here today, not traditional technology companies that are now realizing they've evolved into technology companies such as Visa or Toyota, for instance, right? I mean, cars are kind of computers on wheels, as I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later, and I know Josh has done a lot of work in this area. So we take a very global perspective to these issues for sure. I mean, at a very high level, we advocate for policies that promote and encourage innovation, competition, and private investment that are necessary for technologies such as the IoT to thrive. But then also, you mentioned data. We advocate for policies and the importance of policies that facilitate the global flow of data, certainly very important in today's age, but then also policies that promote trust, and trust is really equivalent in many ways to both privacy and security for us, as I'm sure it is for Angela and many others in the room. One word just about the title, if you will, of this event here, because I know we're kind of generally being asked to comment on that. I mean, one thing I would say is that I think we've got government in the title, and I would, again, taking that global perspective, just remind us all that we should actually be talking about governments, because governments everywhere are grappling with these issues, such as the IoT issue, and certainly the U.S. is arguably one of the leading policy-making governments in this area right now. And I would also encourage us not to look at government in a monolithic way, even within each of these governments. Again, particularly in the IoT space. And again, we can debate what exactly that means. I think Josh listed a whole bunch of things that it could mean. I've also heard increasingly people using the term Internet of Everything, which is probably not a bad term if we think about the fact that the trajectory seems to be that we're just going to connect everything together at one point, or at least if we can figure out how to do that in a way that's safe and secure for all. I mean, that's kind of one of the holy grails, I think, for some, particularly if we're going to realize some of the advantages of big data analytics and actually being able to put all of these benefits together. So, and I think that's that also highlights one of the risks, at least in our view, because now that we're dealing with an Internet of Everything, and when we've got kind of traditional physical regulators coming online, if you will, and discovering the fact that, oh, wait, there are cybersecurity issues in autos or here or there, it actually, I think, honestly, represents a new set of challenges, not because the policymakers shouldn't be interested in these issues, which are very important, but because there are actually, I think, very, very serious questions about whether there are enough cybersecurity professionals to go around, quite frankly. I mean, we've been hearing about DHS trying to fill open requisitions for personnel and others in the federal government for years. If we're now going to have if we're going to connect everything, and every regulator wants to suddenly propose their own set of cybersecurity standards or practices or regulations, there really is a threat of kind of upsetting the apple cart, if you will, of interoperability, which has made the internet itself grow and be such a force for economic and socioeconomic growth. But then also, there's a risk if we magnify this globally of really having a very fragmented system. So I think turning to cybersecurity in particular, some of the things that we advocate for are certainly the promote, and this extends to the IoT, but even beyond, the use of globally interoperable standards and international standards, using risk management-based approaches, which also, number one, allow for some prioritization of risks, because if we're really talking about protecting everything, we do need to have some sense of prioritization of those risks built in there, just from a simple efficiency standpoint, looking at voluntary and flexible types of approaches, and then also very much looking at multi-stakeholder and public-private partnership types of approaches. I mean, the NTIA vulnerability process is one good example of that. There have been several, I think, relatedly out of NIST in recent years. I mean, hopefully by now everyone is familiar with the cybersecurity framework, which is largely grounded in international standards, or certainly consensus best practices and standards. You've also got NIST having done a lot of work recently on the cyber physical systems framework, which does include IoT and smart cities and industrial internet and other applications. And then also more recently, and maybe something that hasn't gotten as much publicity, is that NIST finalized, and the administration has formally blessed an international a U.S. government strategy for international cybersecurity standardization, which just finalized this past December, and an interagency working group has and process is underway to actually try to figure out how to drive international cybersecurity standardization in many of these key areas. Because at least from the NIST perspective, I know having done a lot of work with NIST, I mean they are well aware of these challenges if we don't have cybersecurity policy that really is globally interoperable. So I guess I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
There's a lot to parse there. I'm specifically latching on to the workforce problem because that is an issue in lots of areas. I'm on the HHS Cybersecurity Task Force that came out of the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. And one of the challenges we have when we look at the spate of ransomware, for those who hadn't seen the story, a piece of crimeware inadvertently that affected Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital inadvertently affected patient care. So while it was not the intent of that one Bitcoin ransom to shut down patient care or risk human life, it had the effect. When you look at that, even if we were to magically grow money on trees and try to hire a CISO for every healthcare delivery organization, because many of them don't even have an IT person, let alone a security person, there aren't enough security professionals to fill those roles. So the future workforce is interesting, and if part of the tax to ride the Internet of Things is some level of responsibility for security and privacy, that's a severe constraint that we cannot overlook. So anybody have comments on the workforce or talent problem if everyone's becoming a software company or an Internet of Things company?
So I can give kind of my personal experience. So I was a National Science Foundation Cyber Corps recipient, and what the U.S. government has done over the last, I believe, almost 10 years is fund a cohort of individuals that go to school and have their school paid for and have their housing paid for in return for working for the government for the number of years that they were awarded that fellowship. So internal to the government, I think that the NSF program has been good at slowly increasing the workforce development of security professionals within the government for the commitments that are included in the scholarships. But certainly I would love to see more be done there as well.
I see an interesting list of constraints. I mean, there's a famous quote from Mark Andreessen that software is eating the world, and everybody hears it differently. What he meant was every company, regardless of what you do, is becoming a software company, and I think you punctuated it pretty well with Toyota, right? They woke up one day and they were not just a computer on wheels, but a data center on wheels, right? There's over 70 computers in a lot of these vehicles. And with that comes responsibilities and operational challenges and talent and workforce challenges. When I hear that, I hear software is infecting the world, right? We're putting weakness and connectivity into everything. It's almost spreading like a virus. So the truth is it's somewhere in between the two. I think right now we're in a mode where we want to put software and Bluetooth and connectivity onto everything. It's the bacon principle. Everything's better with bacon. Everything's better with Bluetooth. I think we're going to come to a point where we realize that there's a cost to doing that, and we will accept that cost when it's worth it, and we will avoid that cost when it's not. I don't think we're to that stasis or balance point yet. I'm tempted to ask about the government's problem, but one thing I want to point out, because it was kind of hinted at accidentally, one other framework we find useful when we're talking to these individual manufacturers, because they're so varied, and we'll probably publish this very soon, I'm often asked, how is IoT security different than best practices like the NIST cybersecurity framework? You refer to that quite a bit. One of the ways we say it's different is a lot of our best practices kind of assume certain adversaries, assume certain consequences of failure, et cetera. So the framework we've come up with is that IoT, depending on which vertical you're in, has different adversaries. So it may not be financial adversaries. It may not be nation-state adversaries. It could be accidents and adversaries. It could be ideological. It could be hackers, protests. So different adversaries. Number two, different consequences of failure. The consequences could be confidentiality, or they could be flesh and blood, life and limb, cyber physical damage. Number three, just different operating environments and context. So if you're in an enterprise security environment, we talk about defense in depth and perimeters and segmentation. If you're an insulin pump, you are your own perimeter. You're a migratory nomadic device. Number four, different composition of the hardware, firmware, and software. So we're not using the same stack of infrastructure goods, and therefore some of the countermeasures we depend upon for antivirus or other things don't necessarily run on these bespoke processors. Or they may be too small to do computationally intensive things like encryption. Number five, and this one's a doozy, depending on the market you're in, different economics. The margins on some of these devices are so small, they won't have a fraction of a penny to put into any cybersecurity, and yet they could still affect very high consequence failures. And lastly is different timescales. So something like a cell phone is built to last and is intended to live maybe for a couple years. Something like a Siemens industrial controller is in a capital expenditure model of maybe 30, maybe more. So the timescales vary. So just to recap those, we have different adversaries, different consequences of failure, different operating environments, different composition, different economics, and different timescales. And that's one of the reasons I'll just assert an opinion. I don't think we're going to have a one-size-fits-all government approach. I think we're going to have to look at those and apply the most common sense and most tenable choices of factoring for all those things. Any of those jump out? Anybody can go first. Anybody have an opinion on how to rationalize with those or add to that list?
I hit a lot of the challenges of that spot on. I think I would emphasize that even within any one of those then too, the definition of what it is you're securing keeps changing. And you mentioned it with the stack. So you have hardware, software, firmware, but you also have data. And what does it mean to be securing data at rest, in transit? Authentication, making sure it is, as I mentioned earlier, what it says it is. The concept of, and then also securing the people that are using that data, that they're using it for the right purposes. I think all of the different nodes, if you will, people and things, is a unique challenge that would layer on into each of one of those components of that you said. Then you mentioned the cost. The cost of does it need to be secured? And the cost of failure, I think, is very different. There are a lot of industries that can handle failure. I can handle if my Fitbit doesn't accurately, count my steps. Although I hope today it does. I'm in a new global challenge for that. But in reality, I do care if my heart monitor or the monitor on my newborn is not working. And what's that cost? And I actually mean cost. Insurance liability cost for it not working is very different. So I think there's a monetization of risk that factors in.
Just to comment on that, there's so many issues that Josh highlighted, and so many of those issues are really where our company lives. The issue of segmentation and sort of isolation that actually kind of defines part of the markets that we're getting into. As I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, that a good bit of it is actually education. People need to understand exactly what is at risk, what does our technology do, and I'll try and give you a very practical example to illustrate some of the differences in the different stacks as well. Is that we provide a platform that can generate monitoring data of various types. Anything in the space, we believe we can get that data. Now, the big issue or the big question that arises in terms of education with certain clients is, but how will that impact the rest of my operation? Getting data in terms of monitoring data is one thing. How will the vulnerabilities of that network impact my control system? There's a control system that deals with lighting. There's a control system that deals with HVAC and other measures of operation. And one of the things that customers are asking, very simply is, will you impact the rest of my system, the rest of my operation? And for that reason, to some degree, people can describe just the collection of data as a read-only system. It's only designed to get data. It's not actually designed to control your operation or interact or impact your operation. It's to be affectionately called just read-only. But we recognize that's only one part of the market. The control aspect is a very different market that we realize is part of the larger facility management play. And a simple control that affects your lighting is very different from a control that happens to impact your emergency system. And as we kind of venture into this new space of controls, the framework of design that we're putting in terms of thought of how do you isolate the failures? How do you have the failures fail softly, in a sense? Mm-hmm. These are very real issues that we have to grapple with before we put control solutions out in the market. Mm-hmm. We feel very comfortable with the framework we've developed to collect data. We know it's efficient, we know we can do it for low cost, and we know it's done in a way that actually has virtually no impact on your network. Mm-hmm. But once we venture into controls, that's a very different situation. Obviously, everybody knows that you want to encrypt things, and that's all true. But in terms of addressing the stack is, what happens if you lose connectivity to the cloud? What happens to your control point local on site if you lose connection? How do you fail over softly so that the failure won't be so impactful? And these are all things that we have to grapple from an architectural standpoint that has great implications on both hardware and software. That would be true in the control space, but not necessarily true in the collection of data. So I just wanted to point out, this is just a very practical example of the different markets, different verticals, different considerations, different cost structures, but they all have to factor into the design somehow. And there's education that's always happening between our company and clients, potential clients, because they need to understand what are the potential ramifications. We don't necessarily have all the answers, but we do recognize at a very base level that understanding the impact from a security perspective is key to actually developing a product that people can actually use with confidence. So they are very practical. There's so much more, but I just want to throw in one example.
Just as your friendly warning, in about 10 minutes, we're going to open the floor to questions. So I'm going to go for I'll slightly modify it with your friendly amendment. Let's try to pivot to what kind of certain government agencies and current regulations in the physical space, whether it be medical devices through FDA, whether it be automotive safety through NHTSA, whether it be consumer protection through FTC's legal enforcement. We have these to enforce the public good and public interest and public safety. We have kitchen safety codes. We have pre-flight checks for airplanes that we get in. There's reasons we do this. Is there any, I'll start with potentially the most restrictive, is there any common sense regulation we should consider proactively for governments, plural, and a lot of these are international markets, so I think you naturally get the byproduct. Medical equipment is international, aviation's international, transportation OEMs sell internationally. So there's a natural international bent to a lot of these anyhow. But is there any minimum common sense standard to ensure that we continue to trust the Internet of Things and can enable the market and then market expansion? I'll start with you, John.
Well, I think, first I would say, you pointed out certainly a couple of regulators out there. There are certainly many other regulated industries, as well, that have been specifically regulating in the cybersecurity area for a long time, whether it's financial services or energy or oil and gas or what have you. So I don't think, I certainly was not suggesting that, we should tear up all existing regulatory frameworks and just have a free-for-all, if you will. I think, though, when we look at the executive order that spawned the cybersecurity framework, and when we look at the cybersecurity framework itself, I did want to, I think on your last set of comments, you talked about one-size-fits-all approaches. Just to clarify, certainly we do not, I do not believe that there is a one-size-fits-all approach across governments or across agencies to these issues. But there are, one of the great things about the cybersecurity framework approach is that it is a risk management-based approach, which I think at least it provides those who are using it with a toolbox and some set of guidance to actually make some to at least engage in a risk management process that I think deals with a lot of the issues you were talking about, whether it's business model or risk profile or what have you. And the idea is not that everyone's going to turn the framework, hopefully, into a compliance checklist and just say we have to do this, this, and this, but that they can make more informed risk management-based decisions. Now, the one other thing I would say in particular about what these other regulators who are looking at this issue, whether they've been looking at it for a long time or are freshly looking at it, is that, again, in the executive order itself, there was a section 10 that talked about what I think is euphemistically known to now as kind of this regulatory streamlining. It's an effort to, Michael Daniel put a blog out about it, a year and a half ago or something too. And the idea behind this concept of regulatory streamlining is not to take the framework and turn it into another set of regulations that would be redundant, but rather to look at existing regulatory frameworks in the U.S. that are currently out there. And I would submit for agencies who are looking at these issues now, as opposed to inventing an entirely new set of regulations out of whole cloth, to the extent we can orient our regulatory frameworks at least around something that is risk management based, that is something that at least has a grounding in international and consensus and voluntary best practices and standards, it seems like that is an approach where we can perhaps gain some traction and not necessarily just create a whole new set of regulations, is I guess what I would say about that.
Well, in the spirit of sparking things, I'll just
spark away.
I'll spark. This was unplanned. HHS is heavy on my mind right now because that piece of ransomware, right? So in this particular case, it's a known vulnerability in JBoss, just one of many known vulnerabilities. It's a patchable thing, theoretically. The device manufacturer didn't patch it, the hospitals didn't patch it. And it could lead to loss of life. But more importantly, we used to talk in the Cavalry about the consequences of failure can be measured in loss of life. I think now in this greater Atlantic Council arena, a true failure is a crisis of confidence in the public to trust a market. It could have severe economic impact at a GDP level, domestically and abroad. So while this was an accident and fixed quickly with a ransom payout, you can imagine a sustained denial of service on purpose against such things. If you equate that to a hygiene issue, if a commercial restaurant had rats in the kitchen or wasn't getting rid of E. coli or salmonella, they'd be temporarily shut down. And I don't think we've kind of figured out what our hygiene standards are for the Internet of Things. And I'm not sure what they are because we're torn on, we don't want to stifle the creativity and the innovation that's giving us all these great things. But I do believe that a laissez-faire approach for too long will have the same effect. It will stifle adoption. It'll shatter trust. It will discourage my mother-in-law from trusting her new connected vehicle. So to that end, I'm kind of looking to tease out, I don't even have the answer, but I'm looking to tease out, are there, as a broader observation aside, just to state it clearly, I've found that even the regulatory environments are in a deregulatory phase towards IT. Part of it's that we fear technology, part of it's that we know it's an important part of the economy. And a concern I have is too much reluctance to proactively regulate may shatter the very trust in the market flow that we want to protect. So there's a sweet spot, a Goldilocks zone, perhaps. Any reactions?
So I think from just kind of taking a case-by-case perspective from the FTC, so kind of taking one example and giving some sort of idea of what might a reasonable security measure be, kind of what along the lines of what you mentioned. One good example is a few months ago, the FTC completed charges against AzuzTech, which is a router manufacturer, based on an unfair and deceptive practices related to their routers, their home routers. And so kind of there was, in the complaint itself, a whole list of kind of reasonable security practices that that the FTC alleged that AzuzTech failed to provide. And I think that just kind of reading briefly through the list kind of gives a flavor of some of the practices when it comes to vulnerabilities. Failed to perform security architecture and design reviews, including using readily available secure protocols when designing features. Failed to implement secure default settings. Failed to prevent consumers from using weak default login credentials to protect critical security functions. Performing reasonable and appropriate code review, vulnerability testing, implementing readily available low-cost protections, maintaining an adequate process for addressing security vulnerabilities that come from the research community, and so forth. And I think that these are reasonable security practices. I think that they're probably broadly applicable, and they are not necessarily what we would call prescriptive. They are processes that we would encourage companies to do, and that we do educate companies about when it comes to security. So I think that's kind of one example that from a case-by-case basis you can kind of glean sort of
That sounds-
practices.
If I were an IoT manufacturer, that particular case would terrify me. Interesting. Anyone else?
I'd offer that when we think about regulation, you have to think about the right sizing the regulation, and I think that's different than being averse to it. I think when we think about where is innovation coming from in IoT, it's from small startups. It's from people who had an idea often, and they've created that idea into maybe a product, maybe even a company now that's selling that product. And I think the regulatory framework on companies like that, where those products are going, might be different than large-scale industries that are already heavily regulated. So how do we figure out that, to your point about regulations and one size fit all, the guidance that's needed, and just using the example you just said, that guidance might not be needed for a corporation that's large-scale manufacturing at scale that's already maybe had to learn the hard way compared to maybe a smaller company that's growing at some maturity. And I think the other point I'd offer is, so what else, to your point, is there besides regulation as a way to look at enhancing security? And that's, I think, another question that has to be asked. So what's the complement to regulation? And I would offer it's incentivization. How do you incentivize security in new ways, shapes, and forms? That could be everything from research and development to the most high-end technology areas that can find how do you start security truly embedded at a level such that as edge computing is enhanced, so too the security at the edge is enhanced. And how do we start that process and that discussion so that regulation can find, to your point about kind of the balance it can, and the laissez-faire approach, that there's something there besides only after action.
And to be clear, we should not isolate government equals regulation. Part of the government is regulation, and there are other things as well. NTA, for example, not law enforcement, not regulatory, more convening power. But that is a government role, one that's bearing fruit.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in really quickly. I mean, again, all those NIST examples I used earlier are certainly examples of different types of NIST convening and NIST-led activities that are currently ongoing. There really is also, I mean, there's a lot of other things that government can and is doing. I mean, there's a whole litany of things that were in the Cyber National Action Plan that came out this past year. I mean, a good example of something that the government has done more recently in terms of passing, policy is the, information sharing legislation, which, in part is, and not only passing information sharing legislation, but there is, the implementation is still ongoing, at least in the initial phase of finalizing the rules, but developing an automated information sharing capability. And one of the things that is going to be shared, and that's in the definition of cyber threat information, for instance, are vulnerabilities. I mean, so there is activity underway is what I would suggest. Just to say that it's not should the government regulate or not regulate. So I think that was a really great comment.
I just think if I can, information sharing I think is important. If you look at, for example, the auto ISAC, or any ISAC for that matter, at least with large industry, they have a lot to lose. And the pace of information sharing, if a hack is heard or if a piece of information gets to the press, that's stocks, that is our GDP in many ways. So their motivation for protecting their devices, their infrastructure, their business is really high. So I think that's important to remember, because I think that's why sometimes we feel that there's as you mentioned, it's deregulation. I'm not sure if it's because I think of D as degrading a level of regulation. I think it's maintaining their own rationale for why cybersecurity is important for them, and and maybe it's not deregulation, but it's some other word that's more of the kind of lack of additional regulation.
I definitely sense a hesitance, at least a hesitance. Let's start passing the mic around while we're waiting for our first question. I want to comment on two things that I'm stuck on. One is, I think you raised an interesting point that a lot of the innovation comes from small, but I'm conflicted because the size of the innovator is not necessarily the size of the harm. So I think we should look at this a couple different slices, like the potential for harm should be a consideration, not just the size of the staff of the organization. And the second thing is, while I think we take this as a given, while I love the conversations enabled by the NIST cybersecurity framework, one thing to point out is that, well, two things. It's a voluntary framework, and I don't think the flight I got on here from Boston this morning would have voluntary pre-flight checks or maintenance standards. That we wouldn't want that as a society because of the consequences to the industry and to safety. And two, the people that have pioneered those best practices are the financial services sector and really well-funded organizations. I just talked to a bank that has 500 people on their staff. And despite adherence to these best practices, 100 of the Fortune 100 companies have had a material loss of intellectual property and trade secrets. Nearly every PCI compliant merchant has lost credit cards. We've had incredibly high failure rates in spite of the best practices. Mostly it's been okay because the consequences of failure were tolerable losses. We're still within acceptable fraud rates. You haven't seen a publicly traded company go out of business. The concern I have that nags at me is while I think those are incredibly instructive, I'm not sure a 4% failure rate for human life or for public safety will be tolerated by the public. So I almost wonder if in some ways we're saying, well, let's give it time, we'll eventually catch up to banks. But if we use that same measuring stick, I don't think we'd be happy with the results. So I have some cognitive dissonance on some of those things. Let's go to the first question. Okay.
Oh. Hi, yeah, Zach Tudor with SRI.
Please try to identify yourself as well.
I was doing that. Zach Tudor, SRI International for now. I wanted to poke at something that Dwayne said. So many questions, and this is the most positive one that I have for the moment. You mentioned, that more data. We all want more data, but I don't want more data. I've got tons of data. I want more of the right data, and I think that all of the data that we're going to be inundated with from this exponentiality that Nyla talked about will obscure our ability to detect other things, but also enlarge the attack surface from a privacy perspective. And I want to kind of get back to privacy because that's something I know less about than some of the other things. And so how do you think that explosion will impact all of us? And is there a role for the government either on the privacy side, on the ability to detect cyber attacks, or something else?
So essentially, more data, more problems?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
So the question of more data, I guess I failed to sort of highlight what types of data we're dealing with. More data is kind of a general term that I would use, that when people understand the scope of visibility that they can gain and increase into their operation, they want more data. Now, obviously, there's very different types of data. And one of the things that we are, it's just getting back to this question of the different verticals and the nature of the particular market. One of the things that we try and scale with the types of data is the type of security, obviously. I made mention of read-only versus a control system impact. We're not putting, obviously, confidential information in terms of social security numbers on our networks. If we were, that's a whole different type of scrutiny. Obviously, consumer devices, they have to deal with those types of data. More data is more problems, certainly when it gets to certain types of data. What we're dealing with is expanding a view, a lot of similar types of data and actionable insight. So I totally understand your point, and I appreciate it. I think you're exactly right, which is the fact that somehow we have to address the issue of what is actually being generated and carried on the network in that particular scope and scale, and how do we assure that there is sufficient best practices in place to mitigate the impact. So I absolutely agree with you. I certainly don't have all the answers, all to say that I appreciate the fact that we have to scale. We internally, are looking at the particular types of impact and the types of failures and how do we mitigate that? How do we lessen the impact? And, read-only versus control, very different framework. So.
And I think even within the read-only framework, the principle of data minimization is certainly something that is important from a privacy perspective. So the IoT report from the FTC discusses if you're going to collect data, then collect it for the specific purpose that you need it, and only keep it for as long as you need it, reasonably need it, and then destroy it properly. So I think that as an emphasis coming back, especially as there are more and more sensors or data collection points from IoT devices, will be increasingly important and goes to some of the privacy risks that come up.
Yeah, remember the everything's better with bacon kind of idea. We've been trying to introduce the notion of there's no free lunch. So when the benefits of that connectivity outweigh the additional harm or additional risks introduced by it, then you do it. And when they don't, you don't do it. And right now we've just kind of been blindly assuming, let's collect everything, data, let's connect everything to everything else, and we haven't done very good threat modeling. Even when we do threat modeling, in fact, one of the questions we would ask automakers when we published the 5-star was, which threat modeling framework do you use? And 99% of the answers were, what's threat modeling? When they did do it, they tended to assume, how could someone make money off of this? And they had truncated every other adversary class. And then the hard way, we found out through some just glitches that led to harm, that not only is malice not a prerequisite to harm, you don't even need an adversary. Sometimes gravity or Murphy's Law is your adversary. So it's accidents and adversaries. Yeah.
Make one comment
Yeah.
too. I think, and you used a word, insight. I
Insight?
don't think it's that people want more data, they want more insight. They want more decision-making optimization, and that often comes from more data. But we talked about the workforce, and I know we're here, and the conversation's more on cybersecurity, but I think IoT has really created the need for not just embedded cyber expertise in any staff member, not just specific cyber professionals, but I would also offer, I think we're seeing that in data science. If you look at the need for data scientists right now, who can actually help you figure out what matters in that data, how do you get away from all the false positives you're going to get for alerts or what have you? And you asked a question earlier about workforce. I think as the threat surface just continues to expand and deepen, because you meet many, many more networks of things that are connecting, much more data, much more information and insights that you're getting, having people on staff who have the cyber expertise embedded in their training, not separate. So I'm getting not having a cyber professional alone, but having that skill set to some degree embedded into people, and with a data scientist and some of the skills there. I mean, that's the future workforce. I wish I had that. I hope my children have that and can pay for my retirement off of that. But it's that combination that's going to help us as the data gets big and the surface of the threats and the vulnerabilities get big to navigate through it.
About a year ago, someone asked me if I could point them to someone who was a cybersecurity professional and a data scientist, and I said, sure, but all 8 of them have jobs. Why don't we do this? Let's take 3 rapid fire and we'll answer them cohesively. You don't have a question anymore? Yes. Oh, wait, all right, so you can do the next, yeah.
Quick question, Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. I have a question because one of the biggest cyber risks that I found out from people that are high level is that it's their own operations. They're worried with the data collected that things will be exposed. For instance, how many are temps, how many are regular staffing? This is the auto industry because a lot of them hire through different sources. People are trying to get those stats. They're not giving them out. Also in the courts, there was a problem where people thought blacks were getting the jail sentences 3 times longer than whites for the same crime. So we got the tip, we looked into it, and all of a sudden they don't have that data, because they realized that if somebody put the data in and it was easily collected, they could find out which DA was prosecuting, and it would very pinpoint people. And so we've seen in many different fields that this is a problem. And my question for you, do you see that corporations or governments, because it could be a government, is worried about the risk of them when it comes to cybersecurity? Thank you.
All right, let's collect 2 more and then synthesize the answers. All right.
JP Offer from George Mason. With toys or with cars, the government sets a specification as to what safe is, and regulation relates to the spec and not about how the manufacturers operate. But on the ASUS example, most of the FTC action was about how ASUS operated and not about the router itself. And so is that how you see regulation moving for cyber? And what's your thoughts as to why that might be?
Okay, and 1 more? Okay.
Josh, I was interested in your comments on tolerable risk and tolerable failures. I was wondering what happens when we get an intolerable failure that just completely upsets the balance of what we now understand to be acceptable, what kind of response is that going to provoke from the government, from a regulatory side, and from Congress, perhaps, if there's like a loss of life or a big physical impact? Thanks.
And the very question is what I'm defining as a true failure, true policy failure. All right, in any order you like, and I'll probably back clean up for his. Anybody want to engage on any of those three? Yeah.
I'll start with the question about data security. Now, understanding that our particular space is not necessarily as operational as other spaces, but I can just tell you that one of the things that we do in terms of the sensitivity to the data in and of itself is that we have a use agreement where we are explicitly not the owners of the data that we collect. We have a non-exclusive license to use the data in only a very specific way, which is to generate what we call anonymous sort of baseline tracking. So we would not, we don't have the rights to publish the data, but we've asked and reserved the right to basically generate accumulative statistics that can be done in an anonymous way so that you can't look at a set of data and the conclusions and target a particular organization as being attributable to that data. So that's one of the ways that we handle the sensitivity to the data and the ownership and the vulnerability of the release of that, is that we explicitly do not own it. It is basically in the rights of the client as holders of the data, and we can only use it in a very specific way to do anonymous baselining.
Anyone else?
So on the second question about what is the focus of the particular practices, particularly in the Zeus case with the router, I think that just speaking for myself, not the FTC, I think that a lot of the things that come up in the data security context boil down to what is a company's practices? So what are the types of processes that could have reduced the risk of a failure happening? And so a reduction of the risk in a failure happening could be done by having more secure defaults, designing security in from the start. These are all tend toward more things that are focused on what the business is doing themselves as they go through a software development process or any other security process.
I'm intrigued. I almost want to ask you a follow-up, but I'm intrigued because when security people tend not to like regulation of technology in general as a default. And yet, as we look at some of these use cases, that's challenging our traditional beliefs in certain nuanced ways. I've been asking people, in fact, I was going to ask this panel, time permitting, when regulation is necessary, which attributes make for good regulation versus bad regulation? One of the ones we've been kind of toying with is maybe you regulate the outcome or what must be achieved, but not how it must be achieved. And I think unless I'm hearing you wrong, there's an interesting contrast here between measuring the results and measuring back-end processes or practices, almost like general accounting practices. I hadn't thought of it that way. So is that what you're getting at?
Yes, I think if we were better at metrics and being able to measure that a medical device was safe, then we would actually do the measurements on the thing itself and not on the process. So I think the process is by default.
Yeah, I think the free market innovators tend to like to come up with alternative ways to maybe meet and exceed the goals, but when they know the goal. Interesting. I don't think we have time for another rapid fire, but you want to comment on that? Yeah.
Just on a couple of those questions really quickly. There was the first question. I think what I heard you describing was kind of insider threats that corporations and governments are facing. And I previously worked in a large corporation for 9 years, and I can certainly tell you that the recognition of insider threats is certainly something that I think is top of mind for most risk management professionals. And it also speaks maybe to why some of the types of prescriptive regulations that perhaps might be proposed aren't going to necessarily eliminate that type of threat at all. For instance, if you have a multi-factor authentication requirement, but you have an insider who has the credentials, it doesn't matter. They can break into any system you have. We've certainly seen several high-profile cases of that happening. And just generally on this whole question of regulation for cyber and what's bad and what's good. I mean, I will tell you, certainly express my personal opinion is of the type of regulation that is bad, and it is the type of prescriptive, do it this way type of regulation. And just really, a really good example of that is there is an energy regulation. I forget if it's NERC or FERC or something, but there was a regulation that you must use antivirus software. Fast forward 10 years, antivirus software is seen as largely ineffectual, and a lot of people want to use whitelisting, but they are told, well, we can't because it's not in compliance with the regulation. So security technology also evolves, so we need to try to factor that in.
Go ahead.
Just to the point, too, about the data and then also the device. I mean, I think when we think about IoT, there's the analytics and the computing power at the edge and within the device. There's the analytics that happens when the information from devices gets passed somewhere, cloud or what have you, into a hosting environment. And then there's the analytics about how that all happened and the processing of complex systems. And I think if we can focus on where the futures can drive us, the ability to do more at the edge so that you don't have data sitting in the need for big warehouses, increased spectrum, et cetera, so that computing power gets more and more advanced. You have potentially maybe less that you have to worry about securing because there's less places that can go, or at least it gets down to that you need to make sure that device is actually secure. And that may be just one way to think about how security in the future can be focused and targeted and then potentially regulated.
Yeah, and I don't want to lose your question. I'm kind of defining a policy failure as any high consequence failure that triggers a crisis of confidence in a market. And it's what follows from a crisis of confidence are a few things. One, you'll have the loss of life if it is or physical harm. Two, it'll have an economic hit to maybe a large percentage of GDP. Three, it tends to, if you look at historically, it tends to trigger maybe a compromise of our civil liberties or our core values as a country. Right after a really serious terrorist attack, you tend to have increased surveillance, which tends to spawn hacktivism and defection, and you see the cycle repeat and escalate. And then it could also cost blood and treasure if it were to trigger some sort of military response to something, depending on who the actor was. So when you look at things like that, one of the early advisors to I'm the Cavalry, she actually did a year stint at FTC. It was Andrea Matuition, a law professor. She was at UPenn and Wharton at the time. She reminded us that the Cuyahoga River in Ohio had to catch on fire and stay on fire several times, one time long enough for the film crews to get there, to really tip the consciousness that maybe we should do something about pollution. And while there was an outcry for response, some of those responses were egregious and counterproductive, and some of them were healthy and belong there. And you can think of, fill in the blank, all these other responses. I think a reaction to a crisis tends not to be a thoughtful, planful one. And it's a lot of our beliefs from several of the law professors we've been working with that software liability is imminent. We're just kind of waiting for that moment. And we've long wanted to hold it off. I think if we were to abruptly introduce software liability with one of these crisis of confidence moments, it could have very deleterious effects to the economy. If you were to try to prevent such a crisis of confidence moment and put some scaffolding, you might have a more nuanced and bounded and rational approach that could start to pull in cyber insurance to cover residuals or transparency, et cetera. So one of the things we've been trying to create more conversation around is free markets tend to regulate themselves. One of the major breakdowns is when there's incomplete information for a citizen to make an informed risk decision. And what we've been encouraging is maybe the lightest touch thing that the government or regulators or agencies could incentivize is the creation of more actionable information. So if you're going to buy an IoT device, what's the bill of materials? Are there known vulnerabilities? Is it patchable? For how many years will you commit to patching it? Do you have a vulnerability disclosure program? So as opposed to telling them what to do or how to do it, maybe encouraging transparency as to what they're doing in a pretty digestible way, so you don't need to be a cybersecurity expert. And I'm not writing policy here on stage, but the thought processes are, what's that Goldilocks zone of doing nothing would probably lead to a crisis of confidence moment, doing too much would stifle innovation. So what's reasonable scaffolding to allow for more informed risk choices in free market? All right, that was the best attempt at answering your question. So we have plenty of time to discuss over wine and cheese as well. I'm going to probably give 60 seconds of closing remarks for now while we transition the conversation to the hallway. So I'm going to randomly call you. Dwayne.
Closing remarks. I actually will take a stab at the policy part of it. And some of this is just based on my history. I think every industry just has a history of regulation, and I think you never want to lose touch with that. I worked in the telecom industry, and they had to transition in technologies, but they had a particular standard of 53 minutes per downtime for the last mile. This is a copper link, telephone connection. And when they were projecting out to introduce new technology for fiber optics, they tried to fit it under the same standard. And that was a particularly internal standard that was included in the tariffs as well. And I think there's a parallel with the policy and the regulation as well, is that every industry, like automotive and others, they have particular guidelines that they have kind of gone through over the years. And I think you never want to lose touch with that, but at the same time, you have to be responsive to the changes in technology as well. And it is a challenge, but I think that regulation it's going to happen. I think that's just my opinion. It's going to happen. And I think it has to make sense for the particular industries. And the only point I'll note is that it has to be industry specific at some level. And how granular it gets within that industry, that's to be seen.
Okay. John, 60 seconds.
Thanks. Well, I guess there is a certain, I can see why you sense there's a certain inevitability around regulation generally in this space, particularly if we look at the global landscape. But, again, I guess I would advocate that we really, I think we'd all be better served, and ecosystem cybersecurity would be better served if we don't have geographic, or we don't lean towards geographic and industry-specific regulation if what we're really talking about here is an Internet of Things, which is an Internet of everything, and we want everything to work seamlessly together. I'd also caution, some of the comments, I guess, have suggested that the Internet of Things is now a new thing, and, it's new, I suppose, to a certain extent, but in a lot of ways, it's an extension of the Internet itself. And I would draw a parallel to, I think a lot of these same conversations were going on a few years ago when suddenly cloud computing was the new thing, and there were a lot of bills, that were proposed in Congress and elsewhere to say, oh, do we need cloud computing specific regulations? And I think at the end of the day, the conclusion was no. Even though there are increased risks there, we need to approach these these issues in other ways. I guess I'll just leave it at that to say that we shouldn't necessarily think that we need a whole new set of regulations for the IoT just because it's the latest development regarding the internet.
Nylabeth?
Sure. I think when we think about that, as I mentioned before, the exponential and the juxtaposition of everything that is now under the moniker of IoT, I think it means that there's a need for continued innovation and collaboration. Because I think that's what IoT is. It's constant innovation among complex network systems, devices, and information. And to do that, that takes collaboration. Likewise, I think the role that the government can play is finding ways to foster collaboration, whether it be collaboration across the regulatory ecosystem, collaboration across the research and development organizations to find new ways to incentivize. Where are there areas of additional need, like in cybersecurity, and collaboration across the different industries or market verticals that either produce things in the IoT, the things, or use the things, and to find ways to make sure that collaboration is represented in all of the different roles that the government undertakes.
All right, and we'll end with you, Aaron.
So I think IoT for the average consumer is a new, exciting space where it has grown exponentially in the last few years, and I think that the benefits of having a smart home and having the ability to make sure your garage door is closed if you've forgotten while you're away are all definitely appreciable benefits, and that these are things that will enhance consumers' lives on a day-to-day basis. That said, the risks, I think, are sometimes unique to IoT devices, and I think that having a flexible approach of understanding what security practices and what privacy practices go into helping mitigate those risks. I recall Dan Geer a few years ago talking about embedded systems and the ability with control of 3 points of control on routers, the ability to potentially take down a large-scale number of routers. These are some of the large-scale risks that certain practices can actually directly address, like patching, like the ability to auto-update, and so forth. And so I think that those are practices that are something to keep in mind as we go forward, and I think that this was a helpful discussion in teasing that out, both in any regulated siloed space such as healthcare and energy, but kind of broader into the workplace and into consumers' lives. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So my closing thoughts are, I'm going to come back to one of our first principles that started us on the safety kick about 3 years ago, almost exactly. We said our dependence on connected technology is growing faster than our ability to secure it, and now in areas affecting public safety and human life. So I don't think it's inventing from whole cloth. I think to John's point, we do know quite a bit about cybersecurity. And I do think we haven't yet really grappled with, in very specific use cases, the different adversaries, the different consequences of failure, the different environments, the different composition, the different economics, and the different time horizons and time scales. And I think it behooves this community to figure those out before we have a crisis of faith. Markets depend on trust, and it's up to us to make sure the trust we've already placed in these devices is merited. So I'd encourage that this starts the conversation, doesn't end it, and let's please give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you again to CSM Passcode, and let's have some wine and cheese.